Hi folks, you're with Tassus today, your pushback channel, and thank you for joining this live stream. In this essay, I'd like to talk about transferring of political power. So when in an election, one government or one president or one members of the House of Representatives or the Senate, they lose the election. The loser gracefully leaves and legally leaves, and the winner of the election takes up their political office. So transfer of political power and sharing of power is something that the Western world had, to a large extent, certainly if we look at it throughout history, to a large extent had achieved both these. Now, we think the transfer of power and sharing of power in the Western democracies, that's kind of how things are, and that's the natural state of things. In fact, that's not the case. Throughout history, various nation states and empires and the like have struggled with this idea of succession, how to transfer power to the next government or the next chief or the next king or queen or whatever. So this is something that's vexed people throughout governments and nation states and societies throughout history. So the fact that the West somewhat uniquely really achieved that feat of both the power sharing and the succession, and it goes so smoothly, or has gone so smoothly, then that's the rarity. It's the exception rather than the rule. And if we go back in time, certainly when monarchies and aristocrats and tribal chieftains and local satraps and all that sort of thing were running the show, the idea of succession was a real problem for them. So that's why they adopted this lineage thing, that the offspring of the monarch would then succeed when the monarch died or became infirm or something, the children would succeed them. So it wasn't done necessarily because the child was necessarily the best ruler or the most capable or the most competent, but it prevented the terrible civil wars that tore nations and area provinces to pieces as they struggled over succession. And if we look, say, at in just England as a case in point, there was numerous what we would call civil wars, but really they are wars of succession, and this was sometimes there were multiple claimants to the throne. Now the reason for this is if a monarch didn't have children or the children had died, then rather than risk the civil wars and so on that would come to it, the lords and the various nobles would get together and they'd heavy the king or into saying, well, look, you've got to make an alliance and promise the throne to somebody else that can ensure that order is restored and there's going to be a peaceful transfer of power. So they would do this, but then they'd find that various claims, it could be the king's illegitimate nephew or third cousin or something like that, would pop up somewhere and say that they had some lineage which gave them a claim to the throne. And so they'd all run around raising armies. Now, there was always other nation states or areas around that were ready to make mischief. So they would, even if the claims to the throne were tenuous, sometimes these claimants would be able to go to, say, in England, they'd be able to go to some province in France and say, well, look, if you'll give me money and soldiers, if I take the crown of England, then I'll look after you and give marry your daughter and so on and so forth. So there'd be all these backroom deals be made, and so somebody who otherwise had or has a very tenuous claim to the throne and wouldn't have the money or the means to launch any sort of a meaningful challenge, they can go and go to another nation state and get some help just for the purposes of making mischief and so on. But what it could mean is that there were many years of civil war. Now, with civil wars going on, the merchants can't do business. It's very expensive for the nobles. They've got to raise troops and train them and equip them and so on. That's very expensive. But not only business can't be done, but harvests, are going to be spoiled as armies fight over various territory, and so it's bad news for everybody. And people go into it thinking they're going to win, but warfare throws up some very wild card outcomes. And so, but once they've committed to the struggle, they want to continue with it, and so on. So, but these civil wars cause all sorts of drama, and most of the time, the nobles and even the king would want to do everything they could to avoid that. And the way to avoid that was to arrange for peaceful succession and to have a general agreement about who would replace the king when he died. And great efforts were made to that. The Ottoman Empire had that the Sultan's offspring would succeed the Sultan, but in the event there was no offspring, then the Sultan's younger brother, for example, would take the throne. But when the Sultan died and there was and one of the Sultan's offspring was ready, they would then, because they'd keep the brother or the younger brother or a potential claimant, they keep them sort of pretty much under house arrest, well treated and well fed and looked after, but under house arrest. But the minute they weren't needed anymore, they were potentially a disruptive force. So they had a special assassination squad, if you want to call it that would go in and kill off the Sultan's brother, who's again being kept on ice just in case the Sultan died before he had an heir. Now the rule was that these goons couldn't harm the royal person directly, so they had a long silken cord they would wrap around the unfortunate dude's neck and then stand several paces away so they wouldn't touch him until he was strangled. So these are the sort of the provisions that were made. Sometimes were quite elaborate for succession. Other times they were, particularly if the monarch died suddenly and unexpectedly before he had an heir or before the heir was old enough to assume the throne, then there'd be a regency, and sometimes this would lead to civil war and wars of succession. So generally it was a rough. If you look at, say, Scotland, the wars of succession, the dramas and the carry on, they're almost endless. Ireland, many provinces in Ireland, again, numerous civil wars, and people, the Irish king, regional district kings would go to the Danes and say, help me knock off those dudes there so I can become the king. And so there was all of these internecine struggles. Sometimes they were sorted out quickly, but most of the time they dragged on and caused all sorts of havoc. So no one really wanted it. It was something that was undesirable. So there was always a lot of pressure to and desire to sort out how do we solve this succession. And so the elections in the West were a good way of doing it. Now, I've travelled a lot to third world countries, and I've seen elections there, and they're a sham, they're a farce, they're a fucking joke. The ruling elite are only interested if they win, so they'll rig the election, and if perchance, off chance they lose, then they've got no hesitation in killing the winner and then forcing another election, which they make sure they win that time. A lot of these tin pot dictators and goons and banana republic, generals with 50 million medals hanging off their chest, the sort of the Colonel Gaddafi type people, they like to know. Well, it's a vanity thing. They like to think that they're actually really popular. The fact they're oppressing the crap out of the people or using an iron sort of hand to rule, which Gaddafi actually probably did need to do, but they like to think that they're popular with the people, and so they may run the risk of an election because they've got sycophants around them saying, "Yeah, the people love you. Yeah, you'll win 100% of the vote. Yeah," so they'll have an election and find that they actually lose. So again, they'll just kill off the winner and have another election. So this is this transfer of power, and in the West, it's been dealt with through the democratic process. Now, when it originally began, it was really a bunch of aristocrats who would take the view, well, it's your turn this time, okay, it's our turn next time. So it was all very, very gentlemanly and so on. Not that they didn't didn't try to, such an ancient Rome and even Greece, particularly ancient Rome, try to denigrate and make all sorts of slurs about their political opponents, and so it wasn't always just a gentlemanly thing, but certainly it was to much larger extent than maybe it is today. But the West, the modern West, was able to fashion a system which again was rare, where power was transferred following an election. Sometimes, particularly in, say, the early 1800s, and even through to the mid to late 1800s, at times if the aristocrats or the ruling elite couldn't get what they wanted, they'd go to the king and say the House of Lords was blocking something in England. They'd go to the king and say, listen, you've got to threaten the Lords to say you're going to create another 500 barons or earls or dukes or something like that to go and sit in the House of Lords unless the people there do what they're told. So these sort of threats, sometimes the threats were baseless and the bluff would get called, other times they would do it. And most of the time the recalcitrant lords would back down and the legislation would pass through. But they still wanted to keep a semblance of legality and democratic process. So the legality of the democratic process is what made the transfer of power in the Western nations possible. Now there were say there were aristocracies such as in the early 1900s. Germany was an aristocracy. There was an emperor at the head of state. There was also an emperor at the head of state, and so the Austro-Hungarian Empire and so on. So, but they still had parliaments, and really the monarchs were reluctant to, if there was a unanimous or a very decisive vote in one way or another in the parliaments, the monarchs were usually quite reluctant to overrule it, or technically they could, but they sort of balked at it and would ask nicely for another vote or this sort of thing. So the transfer of power in the West was really pretty unique in terms of world affairs and in terms of history. But are we losing that is where I'm heading with this essay. Are we losing that because say the 2020 presidential election, the globalists were pretty convinced Trump would win, and so they didn't want him to win. So they, okay, well, we'll just illegally corrupt the process, rig the process so he doesn't win. And then they run around saying everyone else is the troublemaker for what they've done. So if you look at that and you put that in context, what it means is that increasingly the globalists are wanting to have their candidates win and their candidates in there so that they can tear up whatever laws they want to get their way and to force the globalist project on an unwilling populace who otherwise wouldn't vote for it and would never agree to it. So this means that the peaceful transfer of power, or the peacefully legal transfer of power, is probably already gone. And if it hasn't gone in such an overt way as it did in the 2020 presidential election, then it's gone. It's disappeared in the sense that the globalists will only tolerate their own candidates standing for election, their own judges deciding on what's legal and what's not, and so on. So this is a great threat, because if candidates appear that are popular with the people and will win the vote, and the globalists openly suppress it as they do in third world tin pot banana republic countries, if they do that, then the means for peaceful transfer of power has broken down, and the outcome of that inevitably, in my view, would be some sort of overt disputation and confrontation. You've been with Tacitus today, your pushback channel. Thank you for listening.